Let's do this front-end development. All right, so a reminder, I'll try to remember this first few weeks, but I'll have the lecture channel open on Discord during lecture. If you have questions, let me know. And I am going to try the lights. This is one step above pitch black, so I am going to try this setting. I think I need this so I don't blind you all every slide. But I wish there were a setting between this and pitch black, but it looks like we don't have one. All right, so let's do front-end development. This is a... Yeah, even this is bright. If I turn the lights off, it'll absolutely blind everyone. It's like looking up Windows errors. It assumes I can't use a computer at all. All right, are we ready? Are we ready to do this? All right, so I mentioned that this is a back-end course. It's mostly back-end, low-level protocols and all that stuff, but we will have to touch some front-end stuff. A lot of it's given to you. I have the starter code for the homework. Homework 1 is out. I don't have the autograder up yet, but the document is out, so you can see everything that you're asked to do. And the first thing is to clone a repo that has some starter code. It has your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But at some points, bless you, but at some points throughout the semester, you'll have to either modify the front end that I give you. Starting with homework 2, you'll have to modify it quite a bit. Or create your own. It's primarily on the project, the group project. There's no starter code for that. You're on your own. You create your own front end. So there are cases where we're going to need to understand some front end from time to time. So I have one single front end lecture. That's all we're going to need. That's all we're going to do. Just to explain how all this stuff works at a very shallow surface level. So let's talk about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. HTML. And the pace will go quick throughout this lecture. I assume most or possibly even all of you have seen a lot of this content already. You're already familiar with I'd be shocked if anybody made it here without knowing what HTML is. Maybe a few of you have, and this is the lecture for you. But if you have seen this, just a quick overview, refresher of the important parts that I need you to know about these things, and then we'll move on to HTTP on Wednesday, where I would assume that probably 0 to maybe 1 of you have gained an understanding of that stuff before now. All right, but let's do this. So hypertext markup language, this is what HTML is. It is not a programming language. That sounds silly, and you probably heard that before if you've been exposed to this, that HTML is not a programming language. It's kind of a silly thing, but don't put HTML under programming languages on your resume. Whenever I see that, that's a red flag. Even when I'm looking at TA applications, they do that in their resume. But if you're applying to a web dev job and you have HTML under programming languages, definitely a red flag. Like, it's not the biggest deal. It's probably just a silly little error. You didn't think about it. But if you're not thinking about that when you're doing your resume and proofreading it 10 times, you're going to make a lot of mistakes on that job. Don't make that mistake. Don't be that person. HTML is not a programming language. It's in the damn acronym. It's a markup language, not a programming language. It's not HTPL. So it's a very, very silly mistake to make to call that a programming language. But it's a markup language, which means HTML is mostly just text. It's text, and then we use ways to mark up that text to be able to add extra meaning to the text. That's what we mean by markup language. There are several of them, HTTP, HTML, the one we're talking about now, and hypertext. This is just absolutely second nature to all of us these days, but when HTML first came out, it was a novel thing, to the idea that you could have a document that links to another document. we just do this every day, second nature. It's just natural to us now. But that was a brand new thing. So it made it right into the acronym. So it gives us the ability to access different documents through links, through clicking a link. And it's a markup language, which gives our text extra meaning. That's what HTML does for us. And it's mostly used for the structure of our web pages. Our HTML is going to define how our web pages are structured, and we'll use CSS and JavaScript for the rest of it. Just some example HTML. We're going to create a file, put all this text there. We open that file in a browser, and we get this. Fancy, huh? Beautiful web page. All right, so let's talk about a few things. HTML is made up of elements, and elements have a start, an open tag, and a close tag, where the close tag has a slash beginning with it. So we have a top-level tag, HTML. This is the start of our HTML, the end of our HTML, start of the header, end of the header, start of the body, end of the body, start of this div, end of this div, etc. You can see the pattern here. So HTML is made up of elements, and these elements can be nested as much as we want in a tree structure. So our top-level element, or our root node to our tree, is the HTML element, which has two child nodes, the head and the body. The head has a child of meta and title. Body has children of h1, p, and div. And these elements can be nested as much as we want, as long as it makes sense to nest them. We wouldn't have come up with an example where it doesn't make sense. It makes sense in a lot of places to infinitely nest these however we want. So we have a tree structure that is called our DOM, the document object model of our web page, and our HTML defines the initial structure of that object. There's a bunch of different types of elements, and I will not go through all of the elements and talk about what different types are. I'm not going to say here's an unordered list, a list element, an ordered list. I'm not going to do that. Table, I don't even mention anywhere in these slides. Table headers and rows. I'm not going to do that. If you want to, I'm going to recommend at least 4 times to start out this lecture. Head over to W3 Schools. I think it's a great beginner resource for all of this, for really a lot of web content, but certainly everything we're going to talk about today. A very good beginner resource. And then once you're comfortable with W3 Schools and you kind of outgrow that, I recommend going to the official documentation and read up on the official documentation for everything that you want to know after that. There can be middle steps. I don't find the middle steps super useful. Like once you've exhausted W3 Schools, you're ready for the official documentation. But if you want some middle steps, you want YouTube tutorials and the like, go for it. Whatever works best for you. But that's my recommended way to go through it. So a few elements I will talk about. HTML is your top-level element. The start of your HTML and the end of your HTML is just your whole document. The header is going to be a bunch of meta information about your page that's not displayed on the page itself, but it can be displayed like around it. I would say literally have a meta tag, obviously meta information. But the title, everything in the title element is going to be displayed in the tab for your page. So it's technically not on your page, it's meta information about the page, but it is still displayed to your user. So some things in the header are displayed to the user. And then body, everything in the body element is what's actually displayed to your user. That is your web page itself. H1 through H6 are headers. H1 is your largest header, so this text is going to be bigger than the rest of the text on the page. P for paragraph, D for div. Div is usually used, it's just a division on the page. It's usually used to section off a part of your page without any other meaning from HTML. So we just want some section of our page. We'll create a div, and it's common to have empty divs. Create a div with just absolutely no content. It's just open tag, close tag. So we have an empty element, very common for divs and spans, but more often divs. There's being a div ends with a new line character. So if you don't want the new line character, you would use a span. Getting into the weeds on that one, though. It's common to have an empty div, and then add functionality to that div using CSS and JavaScript. So I say the HTML doesn't care about the div, but the CSS and the JavaScript might. So it's our way of saying, here's where some stuff will go Again, HTML is worried about the structure of our page. It's going to say this is where that div is going to go, and then CSS and JavaScript start making sense of that. That's it. I'm not going to go through. Well, actually, I guess I will go through a few more. There are some self-closing elements, and I think it's standard now to not add the trailing slash anymore. It used to be standard, and that kind of stuck with me. I think we don't do the trailing slashes anymore, but for best practices. But a few self-closing tags. These are tags where you don't need an open tag and a closing tag. It's just one element that's just one defined by one tag. So for example, an image, it doesn't make sense to say, here's the start of my image, here's the end of my image. You just say, here's my image. So it's a single tag for an image. Same with BR, which is a line break. If we want new line characters in our HTML, a BR tag gives us a BR element, which is a line break. And HR, one of my favorites, for whatever reason, I don't know, I just kind of like them, which is just a horizontal line. It's going to give me a horizontal line. If you look at the course website, you see these all over the place. I like to use them to separate sections of the page. I don't know, it just looks visually nice to me. But that is also a self-closing tag. I don't need an open tag and a closed tag for my horizontal line. Just HR, horizontal rule, done. And HTML can have attributes. We already saw a few in the example. Attributes are defined in the open tag for an element, and they're going to be key value pairs where the keys and values are strings. For what it's worth, we don't put quotes around the name of the attribute, but we do put quotes around the value. I don't know why it's like that. I've just kind of lived with it, but that's the way it is. And we're going to specify any number of attributes in the open tag, separated by space. I only have one per here. But this div element has an attribute named ID with the value myDiv. My meta tag has an attribute charset with the value UTF-8. And my HTML tag has the attribute lang with the value English. So we can add extra attributes to our elements. So this open tag, closed tag syntax, very similar to XML, but XML, to my knowledge anyway, doesn't have a way to add attributes. I think XHTML or X, anyway. But this is going to give us more functionality with HTML. So we have our elements defined by our tags, and those elements can have attributes added to them in the open tag using key value pairs. Comments? I don't have much to say about this, but there's no line comments in HTML. It's only block comments, and this is the syntax for block comments. This less than, exclamation, dash, dash, and then dash, dash, greater than to close your comment. Block comments. But, you know what block comments are at this point in your careers. And finally, Unicode characters. You can just slap Unicode characters in your HTML document itself, or you can have escaped characters. So if you want to add a Unicode character, if you know its Unicode value, if you know its code, then you can add any UTF-8 character using this syntax, ampersand, hashtag, the code, the UTF-8 code, and then a semicolon. And when the browser renders this, it's going to render this as that actual character that you specify with that UTF-8 code. So this is, when it's rendered to the page, is going to be the rook symbol. And some of these, because who's going to remember Unicode characters? You'd have to look them up every single time. Nobody's going to, well, somebody might do that. I don't want to do that. So there are some named characters. For example, this RAR, right arrow, R-A-R-R. If you use that named character, then it's going to give you a right arrow on your web page. And there's certain named characters that just end up being really useful when we're developing. One of those is non-breaking space. NBSP is one that you might want to get familiar with if you're going to do some more front-end development. If you want just a little bit of extra space, add a non-breaking space. The way the browser is going to render your HTML is any amount of white space is going to be counted as one single space. It's going to be rendered as one single space. So if I put web space page, I'm going to get one space there. If I put web space, 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 and just hold down the space bar for 100 spaces, and then page, it's still going to render as a single space. It's going to ignore all of your extra white, horizontal white space. Well, and it's going to ignore all of your vertical white space because you have to do the BR tag, your line break tag. So if you want extra white space, right here I have the rook symbol, a space, and then non-breaking space, which is an escaped space character, and then another space. So in between the rook and the capital W in web page, there's going to be a total of 3 spaces there rendered to the page. So if you want a little bit of extra horizontal white space, adding your non-breaking space can be a quick and easy way to get things aligned the way you want or spaced the way you want. If you want a lot of horizontal space, don't just cut and paste non-breaking space. Don't just cut and paste that 100 times. There are better ways for that. You would use CSS. I would probably, off the top of my head, use a span, and then using CSS, give that span a width, and use my horizontal space that way, or whatever fancy way you have with whatever frameworks you're using these days. Get your white space in a more consistent, better, cleaner way. But if you just need a little bit of extra white space, non-breaking space, quick and dirty tool to get the job done. There are a few other named escaped characters that are going to be very relevant coming up in 3 weeks. LT is less than, GT is greater than, and AMP, AMP is ampersand. Those 3 are going to be very important when we're escaping our HTML. So when we're preventing against HTML injection attacks, we're going to want to escape those characters to their UTF-8 named values and then not have them rendered as HTML. So this will be very important. That's why I have this on slide 1, even though it's more of a nuanced point of HTML. That's HTML. That's all I want to talk about HTML. So we have elements displayed in rendered in a tree-like structure. I say tree-like, a tree structure. That's going to be the document object model, the DOM, and those elements are defined by open and closing tags. Some elements are self-closing. We can add attributes to our elements through their open tag, and we can escape HTML, or we can escape Unicode characters using certain syntax. That's all I want to talk about with HTML. That's all we're going to need to know. And then the first big thing that we talk about with HTML coming up is forms. We will use the form element and input elements to let the browser generate our forms for us. So we'll need to know these things to be able to get that done. But other than that, here's my second recommendation of W3 Schools. I do like W3 Schools. If you're brand new to HTML, if you already know the basics, I mean, W3 Schools is still good to brush up, but if you're beyond W3 Schools, it's not great. It's a good beginner resource. Other than that, go to official documentation and get the more in-depth resources if you're beyond that. And if you do want what I'm not doing, I think it'd be a waste of all of our time, if I'm being honest, in a 300-level CSE course to say, here's an unordered list, here's an ordered list, here's a table. Look, we can have multiple rows and multiple columns. I'm not. At this point, it's right in the syllabus. I expect you to be able to find and read documentation. You can go to W3 Schools, and if you want a table with 6 rows and 15 columns, just go to W3 Schools and figure out how to do that. Or using flexboxes. That's a CSS thing. Flexboxes are actually pretty cool, but we're not going to take time in a back-end development course to talk about that. But if you are interested, and if you are interested in this stuff and you want to come to office hours because you're having trouble understanding the documentation out there, we'll always be happy to help in office hours. When I say that, I just mean I'm not going to take up lecture time. I'm not going to take up everybody's time to do that. I got 1 lecture on front end. I think that might already be too much. I think this might be too much front end for this course. But I really want to get these things out there, so I want to make sure we all know this stuff. All right, so CSS. Our HTML is used for the structure of the page. CSS is going to add style, cascading style sheet. I really don't expand the acronym. I thought I didn't. Cascading style sheet is going to add style to our pages. So instead of just saying, here's the structure, here's where the things are, this is going to give us a lot of flexibility in how that structure is displayed through the user. That's what CSS is doing for us. And we're going to separate these concerns. HTML, structure, CSS, style, and when we get to JavaScript, functionality. 3 different goals, 3 different technologies. We're going to separate those, and we will separate them by files. You can technically put your CSS, your style, and your scripts inside your HTML file and just have everything in one file. Please don't do that. Like, that's fine if you're creating your first web page ever, but at this point, separate your stuff. And the handout code for homework 1, I'm going to have it as separate files. It is already. You can see it right now. Separate files. We're going to separate those concerns and have each file, each portion of our page concerned with a different goal, structure, style, functionality. We're going to separate those things. Or else we're going to end up with one huge HTML file, which is going to be next to impossible to maintain. We don't like that. As developers, we want to follow good practices. CSS, you're never going to be graded on the style of anything you submit. So if your CSS is all complete trash or non-existent, except where explicitly said that it has to exist, I'm not going to care. It's a back-end course. I don't care how crappy your front end looks, as long as it works. If it has the functionality, you're getting your points. On the opposite side of that, if your front end looks amazing, you spent a lot of time working on the CSS and the style of your page, and it looks absolutely beautiful, but it doesn't work, you're not getting points. Like, it's got to work. That's what I'm concerned about with this class. That said, we're going to just go over quickly what CSS is and then move on from it. But there's no part of this course where it's like you have to have a page that looks great. In CSE 370, it's the opposite. Your page needs to, well, it has to work too. Don't get me wrong on that one. But your page does have to look nice enough to be usable and offer a good user experience. So if you are into that stuff, CSE 370. Can you center a picture without, can I center a picture without Google? I can't center a picture with Google. Me and CSS don't get along at all. I think that's part of why I don't like front-end development. Man, I just can't get stuff done with CSS. It's easier these days, but still not easy. It's not objectively easy. And it depends what you want. If you want an image centered, I'll go down this rabbit hole a little bit. If I wanted an image centered on the entire page, like the whole viewport, vertically, horizontally, I think I could get that done pretty quick, maybe even off the top of my head. I would have to take a few guesses. It's when you want an image that's in a div over here and then center it to that div. That gets significantly harder because the way that div, what I find is the div is visually one size, but actually a different size, and your image is going to be centered to the actual size and not go where you actually want it to go, at least in my experience. So just straight up a page with a single image, and that's the entire page, not hard. But once your page gets more complex, it's tougher. I've spent a lot of time in the handout code. When you open that up and you open the HTML, I spent a lot of time resizing the window and trying to get everything to flow good, and it's still, in certain window sizes, it's still kind of crappy. I do have that image vertically centered, though, for what it's worth, but inside a div. But it's hard to accommodate every screen size. And in general, I struggle with it, but it's hard in general to get one page that works for a phone in vertical mode, horizontal mode, and also works great on desktop, on a laptop, on a giant screen. It's hard to build one page, one app that works great for all of them, which has spawned the web dev philosophy of mobile first. And today I feel like they go mobile only. So even if you have a nice big screen, you're looking at the mobile version of the site because it's hard to have one that works well for both. So developers now have just been focusing on mobile, optimized for mobile on a small screen, and then if you got a big screen, whatever, you just get the mobile experience anyway. Frustrating if you're on your laptop, but it's what a lot of the web is, and for good reason. It's hard. It's just hard to have an app that works for both, especially when you can rotate the screen. That's the really tough one. All right. Anyway, let's get on with it. So here's what CSS looks like. So we'll have a separate file, and this is what the syntax of that file will look like. We're going to specify the scope of some properties that we want to add. So every element of type body, of which there should only be one for any given page, is going to have anything in the following braces have these properties applied to it. So we're going to have a background, which will be the background color set to aqua, and you do need your semicolons here. If you miss this semicolon right here, for example, you'll be chasing down CSS errors for a while, like I have. Missing semicolons in CSS gets frustrating because now's as good a time as any to mention this, but the browsers really try to help you out a lot, in my opinion, to a fault. So if you have mistakes in your CSS, your HTML, and to an extent in your JavaScript too, like if you miss a semicolon in your JavaScript, your page is still going to run. It's still going to do the thing, hopefully correctly. But if you have a lot of mistakes in your HTML and CSS especially, the browser is going to try its hardest to render your page and to guess what you meant and render something to the user. So if you have a lot of little mistakes, there's not going to be like errors. It's not going to say syntax error on line 57. It's going to say, here's what I think your page is supposed to look like, and it's not going to look right, and then you have to go through debug cycles. So missing a semicolon in CSS can take a while if you don't look in the right spot right away, and if your IDE is not telling you right away, can be tough. So semicolons do have to be there. All right, some colors have names. So aqua is a named color, or if you don't want to use the named colors, we can use the hex value for a color. So if we use hashtag and then a 2 hex character R value, red value, a 2 hex character green value, and a 2 hex character B value. This is the RGB value for a color, where R, G, and B can range from 0 to 255. So I have FF, I have 255 for red, 0 for green, and 0 for blue. So this is me saying I want my paragraph text to be red, to be just straight up flat red. And then font size, I'm going to make that font giant too. I'm going to make it 50-point font. I mentioned the headers, H1 through H6. That's going to make your font larger or smaller. But really, that's pretty inflexible to just straight up use your H1 through H6. So changing your font size using CSS is usually the preferred way. That's how we're going to change the font size. Though you should still use your headers using your H1 through H6 to organize your page. If you have your top header as H1, and then H2 is going to start each subsection. H3 is a subsection of each subsection. To organize the structure of your page still, that's going to help web crawlers. It's going to help screen readers to understand the organization of your page. If you just have a whole bunch of paragraphs with different font sizes with CSS, it's going to be very hard to programmatically parse through what your page is trying to tell a human, even though it would display the same to a human being. It'd be harder for those bots. It's going to hurt your SEO, your search engine optimization. It's going to hurt your accessibility for screen readers and things like that. But in CSS, you could say H1 font size and set it to whatever the hell you want it to be. Okay, so we have to import our CSS through our HTML. We'll put that in the head. Head is meta information, stuff that's not displaying on the page itself. We're going to link this file we're going to call style.css. That's going to make another request to the server and say, hey, I need a file called style.css. We're going to take this CSS and save it in a file called style.css, and then link that using this link self-closing tag to create a link element that's going to request style.css. That's going to add that style to this page, and then we have our body background is aqua, so we have a aqua background. Our paragraph has giant red text, so our paragraph, my content, giant red text, exactly the way we want it to be. Very beautiful page, too. Yeah, that's all I want to say there. Okay, but this is pretty inflexible. When I say every element of type paragraph has this styling applied to it, it's really inflexible. So now I have multiple paragraphs throughout my page, and every single one of them has to have giant red text because somewhere I want a giant red text. We don't like this. Usually, it's pretty bad practice to say every single element of a certain type gets this styling applied to it. Generally, we don't want to do that. We want to get a little more flexible with it, and that's where we're going to use classes. This is the preferred, the common way, pretty much the way to add styling using CSS is through classes. We're going to take our HTML attributes, which we just learned, and add an attribute called class, and then give our elements that we want to style class names. And then in our CSS, we're going to specify the class name and change styling based on those classes. So here I'm saying every paragraph with the class red, that's going to get this styling, which is changing the text to red. And every paragraph with the class green is going to get this styling applied to it, which is changing the text to green, of course. So now each one of these paragraphs has different styling associated with it by specifying different classes for those elements through our attributes. We'll get all the words in there. This is still not super flexible, or rather maybe too flexible. What we tend to want to do is we don't want to just style our paragraphs. We want to style anything with a certain class. So instead of saying every paragraph with the class green, like here we're saying every paragraph with this class red gets this styling, what we can do is leave off the paragraph and just say everything, every element of any type with the class green by just saying dot green, every element with the class green is going to get this styling attached to it. So my paragraph with class green, even though I didn't specify paragraphs, I said anything with the class green. This has the class green. I don't care what type it is. It's going to be green. But this div with class red did not get red because we specified only paragraphs with the class red get this styling. So this div with the class red did not get that styling. But if we just did dot red, then this styling would be applied to the div in addition to the paragraph. So it gives us better reusability of our classes. In our CSS, we define a class and give it a whole bunch of properties. We decide we want divs and paragraphs and spans and table elements and links to all get that styling. No big deal. We just say dot class name. Helps us reuse our CSS across elements of different types. And sometimes, in my experience, I find this to be the least useful. I mean, I guess maybe the least useful is applying to every single element of a specific type. This is just way too powerful. But this is not powerful enough. But we can, for what it's worth, add styling to a specific element by ID. So if you add an ID, and we saw one ID earlier, in the earlier example, which was the same div, but ID as an attribute is an HTML attribute to an HTML element. We're going to add an ID attribute. Those IDs should be unique. If I have ID equals my div right here, nowhere else on this page should I have an element with an ID of my div. These should be unique. I say should because, again, the browser is going to do whatever it can to render your page. If you have multiple IDs, it'll give you a warning in the console, but it's not going to crash. It's still going to render your page, and you're just going to have two elements with the same ID. That shouldn't happen. It's can cause errors somewhere, not errors, but it can cause not what you want. What am I trying to say there? It's going to be weird behavior. It's not going to really do what you want it to do in a lot of situations if you have multiple elements with the same ID. So they should be unique, but nothing in the browser is going to really force you to have them unique. But they should be unique. If they're not unique, you're definitely doing something wrong. So this should be unique, and then CSS is going to say, with a hashtag, I want to add this styling to the one element with the ID of my div. And then we can add styling to a specific element. It's a little too granular. Why not just give it a class name? And then if you do want to reuse this styling, you can give something else that class name. It's a little too restrictive to say this only one element gets this styling. A little too much for my taste, too specific. But we can. It is part of CSS. So there it is. Mostly just want to talk about IDs because they're going to come up a lot. IDs are useful, just not for CSS so much. And we can have multiple classes. for what it's worth. Space separated. I don't really have anything else to say. That's the syntax. If I want two classes applied to the same 2 plus, I could have 100 classes applied to the same element. Space separated list of class names. Questions thus far? That's CSS. I'm done with CSS. As always, my 3rd out of 4 recommendations for W3 schools. It goes through, all the properties. There's all kinds of properties in CSS you can use. Some of them will sometimes actually work. Some of them don't. And then it's frustrating. I don't know. I find CSS frustrating. Does each tag represent an element? In the HTML, yes. Yeah, so when I say element, I mean like this is one element defined by its open and closing tag, or if it's a self-closing element, a self-closing tag, it might just be the one tag. But this is an element, this is an element, this is an element. So there's 3 elements in this HTML snippet. Little disclaimer, but I'm not going to go through all the syntax of JavaScript. Again, at this point, you're expected to be able to go through that. But that said, there's very little JavaScript that I expect you to understand. I give you most of the JavaScript you'll need. I don't recall if anywhere on the homework I require you to edit JavaScript. I might at some point, especially for application objectives, I think I do. But I don't think I do for learning objectives, so you might even get away with 0 JavaScript understanding if that's where you're at. But I won't go over the syntax. I won't say, like, here's how you do a loop, here's how you do a conditional or something. We're doing that in 1.16 right now with Java. It makes sense to do that. In 3.12, in a 300-level CSE class, I think you would be bored if I did that. I think that's fair to say. Like here, your code blocks are defined by brace. It'd just be super boring. So I'm not going to take everybody's time. But if you're struggling with that, stop by office hours. I'll be happy to help you out. I'll be happy to do that lecture in office hours. I'm just not going to take everybody's time to do it. So my 4th out of 4 recommendations. If you do want that, W3 Schools, great tutorial. But I want to highlight the parts of JavaScript that we will use, and what we. Is that on my previous one? On my next slide. We have HTML for structure, CSS for style. JavaScript is going to give us the functionality. What JavaScript does for us is actually makes our pages dynamic. We can actually do stuff. Like everything through HTML and CSS that I talked about, nothing in there did anything. It just displayed information to the user and prettied up that information. This is what I call poster sites, or other people, I guess, would just call them websites, as opposed to web apps, which we want to build in this course, where you're just displaying information. If you have like a restaurant and you want to post the menu and a phone number where you can call to make reservations, that's perfectly fine. That's all you need is HTML and CSS. But when you want to start interacting with the users, that's where we're going to sprinkle in some JavaScript. And to be fair, with HTML and CSS, we could use HTML forms and send additional requests to the server and load different pages based on form loads. We could do a little bit of interaction like that, but really we're going to want JavaScript to amp up our pages and give them a lot more functionality. So JavaScript is our go-to with that. And JavaScript is a programming language. This is where we actually get to program. HTML and CSS are not programming languages. And technically, I was called out on this, so I had to say this every time I hit this slide from now on until the rest of my career. But technically, and I had to look into it, it's true. Technically, HTML and CSS combined is Turing complete. You could actually use that as a programming language in a technical sense. You shouldn't ever do that unless you're just doing it for fun. That's fine. Do whatever you want for fun. But in practice, if you're building a web page and your goal is to build the page and build it well and maintainable, don't ever do JavaScript is your programming language. This is how we're going to add actual code to our page, which means what our pages can do, anything you can code, anything you can dream up, you can do once you sprinkle in JavaScript. Like whatever you want a web page to do, anything. You got it. With a few caveats, a few exceptions that we'll talk about in a second. Because of this. So the way this works, the way it works when you visit a web page is you type in the URL or you click a link or whatever. That's going to talk to the web server, and you'll understand this in great detail after Wednesday's lecture, or at least after you finish homework 1. You're going to send a request for the HTML of the page. You get that HTML. That HTML has links like the style sheet we saw. It's going to have script tags to get some JavaScript. It's going to have images with sources to download some images. So the browser is going to go back to that server and possibly other servers and say, hey, I need all this other stuff to render this page. Gets all the stuff through all these requests, smashes it all together, and then renders it to the page for the user, and then runs that JavaScript. And that's the key part we want to focus on right now. It's going to download some JavaScript code that somebody you probably never met before, some developer somewhere on the planet wrote. You're going to download their code and run it on your machine. You should immediately be concerned with that. This is something called an arbitrary code execution attack. It's what a lot of hackers are trying to do. Hacker, the term is overused, but a lot of attackers are trying to do is trying to execute arbitrary code on your machine and use that code to break things, take things over, expand their botnet, whatever they're doing with their code. But arbitrary code execution, that's what we do every time we click a link on the internet. So we need a way to make this safe, and luckily it is safe, mostly, I'll say. But there are security implications. And we have answers to these security implications, which as developers, we have to be concerned about. So first and foremost, the biggest thing is you can't read or write files with JavaScript running in the browser. Cannot read or write files. And I should add edit. Hopefully it's implied there, but you can't edit files either. So no file I/O at all. You can't talk to disk at all. So right there, if you're an attacker and you're trying to write some JavaScript that's going to run when somebody visits your page, what are you going to attack if you can't access the hard drive? There's just not a lot you can do. There's definitely things you could do, but you're strongly limited. Yeah. So the code itself is saved. Well, is it saved to disk? But it's running, but that environment that it's running in doesn't have access to disk. So the browser isn't going to give your executing JavaScript any functionality, any access to disk. I believe the code, so the other option would be maybe it's just stored in memory. I think it is stored to disk, though. The file itself, your code that's running, but the browser won't let that code access disk. Yeah, when I say memory, I mean RAM, yeah. I don't have a great answer for that. I wish it didn't use so much. I don't think for that specific reason. I mean, maybe that's a contributor. But even when you go to like a tiny website, it uses so much RAM. It uses way more than the sum of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It uses way, way too much. That's one of the biggest memory hogs, except my IDEs, Chrome and any Chromium-based browsers. Oh, it's ridiculous. And the next two, I want to come back to read-write files, but the next two, hopefully a little more understandable. You can't access any other tabs or windows. So when you have a browser open with a whole bunch of tabs and multiple windows, the JavaScript running on one page is in an isolated environment. It can't access, the browser will not give it access to the other tabs and other windows. And it can't access any data from other sites, so it can't access the cookies or local storage saved on the browser for any other website. So you can't just say, hey, give me the Facebook cookies on this page, or for this user. It's just not going to cough those up. I say directly, but to access those, it would have to be an attack vector. It would have to be a vulnerability that they're exploiting. And we have other ways to patch those vulnerabilities that we'll talk about throughout the semester. So these two are hopefully a little more self-explanatory. You can't just directly steal things from the other pages, but the read and write files really limits what you can attack with JavaScript, which also limits what we can do as developers. So when you're writing a web page, you can't read or write files, and this includes your own files. So a common thing you might want to do is have your website hosted as HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then that JavaScript reads some data from your server. So you also request a fourth or whatever, an additional file with data.json, just a whole bunch of data that you want to read from your site, and you have the user download that file. And then in your JavaScript, you say open data.json. You can't do that. That would be file I/O. You can't do it. Even if the file came from your server, you can't access it. You can't write in your JavaScript, open up the HTML file and read it. Open up the CSS file and read it. You can't do that because it's file I/O. Even though they're your own files, and you're like, well, the browser could verify that it came from my server. And can't do it. Not allowed. No file I/O. Period. Can't do it. So this is something we always have to keep in mind when we're developing. It's for very good reason that you can't read and write files, but that does include your own files. So just be aware of that when you're developing. You can't do file I/O. You have to find different solutions. If you want to edit the HTML, you can't access the HTML file, but you can access the DOM. So after the browser renders your HTML file and creates the DOM, you can go to the DOM and modify that. So we can still do things. We just can't read files directly. And if you want to read a data file in the example I gave, you would make an AJAX call, ask the server for the contents of that file, and get the contents of the file in an AJAX response, and then parse that and do whatever you want with it. You just can't read the file directly. But we have workarounds. We have ways to handle this. So here's one of the most basic things we can do to edit the DOM using JavaScript. We're going to get an element by ID, and we can get like all the elements of a specific type, all the elements of a certain class. There's a lot of different ways to access the DOM, or we can just navigate the tree directly. One of the most useful I find is getting an element by ID. Now I know I have one very specific element of my page, and then here I can change whatever I want with this element. Here I'm going to change the inner HTML. So anything between the open tag and the close tag, it's going to replace it with whatever I say here. So that's why when we have that empty div on the first example, and then I say, well, we populate it later, this is one way that we can populate it with JavaScript and populate it dynamically with whatever our code generates in whatever situation we're in, or reacting to the user, whatever we want to do. Just get this page. JavaScript is fundamentally event-based, so we can react to events. Usually, in this example,